Welcome everyone to this series of webinars on sequential decision optimization with media mix models. This webinar series is tailored for marketing professionals and individuals working with business intelligence. It will feature content that spans from slightly to highly technical. Today, we will be discussing the recently released preprint of our report detailing our approach to optimizing marketing expenditure. This session is designed for marketing professionals with a technical background, and it is independent of the preceding two sessions, meaning there is no prerequisite to have attended them before participating in this one. We will be assuming that our audience has some basic knowledge in machine learning, causal inference, and control. However, marketing professionals without an extensive technical background can also find valuable insights in today's session, as certain topics are presented in a way that is easily digestible for all levels of expertise. We will not delve deeply into the mathematical details in this session, and unlike the two preceding sessions, the primary purpose here is not educational. This session serves solely as a review/teaser of the report. For a more comprehensive understanding of the mathematical details, please refer to the report, which you can access through the link provided below. I want to highlight that the released report is a preprint and may be changed in the future, therefore check for the latest version. As many of you may be aware, we provide an automated marketing solution designed to streamline the entire advertising process on digital platforms. Within our system, we implement numerous optimization techniques to maximize return on ad spend. This involves the application of techniques derived from applied mathematics and machine learning. Additionally, we have a dedicated team of customer service agents who offer personalized support and guidance. As for myself, my name is Maximilian Licke Agdur. I am the head of AI here at Amanda AI, and I've been working here for about 3.5 years focusing on applied mathematics. I also have ongoing studies at the Royal Institute of Technology here in Stockholm, just to keep up to date with the latest in machine learning. And my goal, along with Amanda AI's, is to stay at the forefront of data-driven marketing. And we aim to achieve this by combining a solid grasp of applied mathematics with a deep understanding of the marketing landscape. So, automated solutions have entered the realm of digital marketing. With the abundance of available data for advertisers, there's a notable opportunity to explore easily accessible data that offers detailed insights into different aspects of marketing. Advertisers can capitalize on these insights by making real-time adjustments to their advertising setups. This leads to the need for automated data-driven solutions, allowing for the collection of valuable insights and informed actions based on the available data in a computerized setting. Amanda AI serves as a provider of these services. We automate the whole digital marketing process for advertisers, ranging from constructing campaigns and ad sets to optimizations such as optimizing bids. A particularly challenging optimization problem is the one of allocating budgets between marketing entities. A way of doing this is to use media mix models to model the environment and then act in it based on the insights these models provide. Another typical approach is to use data-driven multi-touch attribution. However, in the report and in this session, we will not discuss data-driven MTA due to the demise of cookies and the increasing amount of tracking regulations. So, most literature on media mix models focuses on the analytical dimension, aiming to estimate the causal impact of investments or predict future outcomes. Although some reports discuss optimizing marketing expenditure based on the model, they typically adopt an exploitative approach. Notably, these studies overlook the exploration versus exploitation trade-off, the sequential nature of decision-making, and the opportunity to address the challenges encountered with modeling marketing response by using techniques from the literature on sequential decision optimization. Now, one possible explanation for this gap is the limited integration of automated solutions in marketing, leaving analysts solely responsible for explaining the causal impacts of marketing investments rather than actively participating in decision-making processes. In the report and this session, we formulate the problem of optimizing marketing expenditures between marketing entities as a sequential decision optimization problem under uncertainty. We consider a campaign-based segmentation and daily allocations, and we deploy techniques from the sequential decision optimization communities to deal with the inherent exploration versus exploitation trade-off. The preceding research relevant to the report can be categorized into two main themes. First off, we have the studies that focuses on the modeling aspect and the associated challenges one faces when modeling marketing response. And secondly, we have the reports that center on sequential decision optimization. When it comes to reports focusing on the model aspect, the work by Wigren and Cornell serves as a great introduction to marketing mix modeling. Furthermore, for Bayesian media mix modeling, this Google report by Yin, Wang and their colleagues serves as a valuable resource. In contrast to these reports, we consider daily data and time-varying saturation coefficients, two factors that are important to be able to capitalize on demand spikes occurring due to the day of the week or month, special events, pay dates, etc. However, we derive insights from the report made by Yin and Wang to set non-informative priors. For an efficient incorporation of time-varying coefficients, I recommend studying the Uber paper authored by Ng, Wang and Dai. In contrast to their report, we incorporate saturation coefficients that are mapped onto the day of the week, the day of the month, pay dates, etc. And this makes them easily forecastable over an horizon, such that we can capitalize on the previously mentioned demand spikes. However, we incorporate their proposed weighting scheme to compute stochastically time-varying parameters. In the broader literature on media mix models, as well as in the previously mentioned reports, the issue of endogeneity is often acknowledged, but the researchers tend to not explicitly address it within their modeling schemes, except for mentioning the possibility of incorporating priors from experimental data. Moreover, they often overlook the impact of marketing on brand building. An exception to this is Peter Kane's report modeling short and long-term marketing effects in the consumer purchase journey. In this report, he explicitly addresses these challenges. In contrast to the report made by Kane, our focus is on Bayesian methods, whereas Kane took on a frequentist approach. As for comprehending the challenges of modeling marketing response, I recommend studying the Google report Challenges and Opportunities in Media Mix Modeling by Shannon Perry. In our report, we aim to address some of these challenges by leveraging the opportunity to explicitly control inputs via experimentation, and we aim to do so efficiently by incorporating techniques from the sequential decision optimization communities. Google also has an open source package made for media mix modeling called Lightweight MMM. However, it lacks the capability to accommodate time-varying saturation coefficients, and it solely optimizes across channels and not time, diminishing its utility in our specific context. Furthermore, Facebook also has their open source packages Prophet and Robin. However, these packages focuses on forecasting rather than inferring the impact of different marketing investments, making them largely ineffective in our context. Moving on to the decision-making process, and in particularly sequential decision optimization, there was actually quite a lot of research being conducted on budget allocation between marketing entities in the 60s, 70s and 80s. However, these reports predominantly centered on differential equation models rather than what we refer to today as media mix models. Outside of our specific context, the literature on sequential decision optimization is vast, with various communities offering approaches to formulate our problem according to their typical schemes. In our report, we integrate concepts from Bayesian reinforcement learning and dual control. For an introduction to Bayesian RL, I recommend reviewing a survey made by Gavamsede called Bayesian Reinforcement Learning, a Survey. Additionally, for insights into dual control, Ali Mesbah's survey, Stochastic Model Predictive Control with Active Uncertainty Learning, a survey on dual control, serves as a very valuable resource. Furthermore, we incorporate concepts from sequential optimal experimental design. And for an introduction to this topic, Modern Bayesian Experimental Design by Rainforth, Foster and Ivanova provides a comprehensive overview. For full references to these reports, please refer to the last slide. And for a full breakdown of the related work, refer to the report. With that being said, let's discuss the environment. In the report, we consider two marketing channels, Facebook and Google. However, our approach can also be extended to other channels such as Bing or Amazon. Now, the internal dynamics of these platforms will significantly affect how effective our budget allocator will be. Furthermore, the strategies implemented in our automated product will also play a significant role in the effectiveness of the budget allocator. Now, as for Facebook, our implementation focuses on upper funnel activities aiming to generate awareness and interest in the client's products. Whereas our implementation for Google, in general, works on lower funnel activities aiming to generate sales from already interested customers. As for the internal dynamics of Facebook, Facebook uses its internal optimization scheme to optimize the utility for the advertiser. In particular, what is important to know when constructing budget plans is that if we increase or decrease our budget by a substantial amount for a marketing campaign, Facebook states that they will reset what their internal optimization scheme has been taught. Thus, to avoid this issue, our algorithm must adhere to day-to-day increase/decrease budget constraints. As for Google, what is noticeable is the ecosystem in which the marketing campaigns operate. As certain advertising campaigns show their ads in response to search queries, the customers essentially self-select into the treatment. This is also known as selection bias, and this can generate biased estimates of the impact of, for example, paid search expenditures on sales if not handled carefully. As for our implementation, we in general do not control the brand campaign budget. We also target far more keywords than the general advertiser. Since we have scrapers that scrape all the material on the client's website, we can construct very large sets of broad keywords. Furthermore, we set capped budgets on the Google campaigns. Now, this implies that we do not allow Google to determine the final expenditure solely based on return on ad spend targets and the underlying demand. These factors will be important when discussing the typical challenges that advertisers face when allocating budgets between marketing entities. Now, we will proceed to discuss some of those challenges. Now, the typical challenges advertisers face when modeling marketing response are multilinearity, endogeneity issues, historical data with low variance in expenditure, and a low signal-to-noise ratio in the environment. First off, multilinearity stems from advertisers tending to increase and decrease budgets for marketing entities in tandem. It makes it difficult to discern the impact of a single marketing entity. Another typical challenge we encounter a lot is that of low variance in expenditure in historical data. Now, advertisers tend to experiment infrequently and usually keep budgets set on a constant level. And when they do decide to experiment, they tend to construct experiments with inputs that are strongly correlated. Another issue is that human behavior is inherently heterogeneous, and this will lead to a response that exhibits a low signal-to-noise ratio. Furthermore, in a regression context, endogeneity issues will appear when one of our independent variables is correlated with the error term. This happens when we have an unobserved co-founder affecting both the outcome and our independent variables. A typical one in our context is demand. Assume now that you set uncapped budgets in Google and let Google dictate the ultimate expenditure based on the underlying demand and your return on ad spend targets. What probably will happen is that Google will increase the budget as much as possible during high demand, since it measures the success of the campaign based on the conversions it got attributed. This will lead to endogeneity issues when you're trying to measure the impact of, for example, paid search expenditure on sales. Another such unobserved co-founder is consumer predisposition, as pointed out in the report by Peter Kane I previously mentioned. If your marketing campaigns are targeted towards customers who have already decided to purchase from you, and they search for your product on Google to locate, for example, the nearest store, as well as customers who are still undecided and are just browsing the web trying to find discount offers, the causal effect of, for example, web traffic on sales can be bidirectional. Since in the first case, it was probably the sale that led to the website visit, and in the latter case, the website visit actually had an incremental effect on sales. Peter Kane addressed this issue by noting that different cross-sections will have different customer segments. Then, by deploying a fixed effects approach alongside weighting competing DAGs, he was able to mitigate these endogeneity issues. Therefore, I highly recommend studying his report. Now, I want to highlight that our implementation mitigates some of these endogeneity issues. First off, we set capped budgets on our Google campaigns. Secondly, we target a very broad range of keywords. Thirdly, the allocator does not distribute the budget among various countries for a client. Lastly, we in general do not control the brand campaign budget. These factors mitigate endogeneity issues to some extent. In particular, in comparison to the normal advertiser who uses very narrow keywords, allocating large portions of budget to the brand campaign, and set uncapped budgets for campaigns on Google. However, these factors do not eliminate the biases that comes with these unobserved co-founders. To deal with the remaining biases, we will rely on experimentation, and we will try to balance the exploration versus exploitation trade-off to do so efficiently. Now, in our context, we encounter additional challenges, but also some opportunities. Primarily, we're grappling with an optimization problem rather than an analytics problem. This introduces challenges such as navigating the exploration versus exploitation trade-off. However, it also enables active experimentation in an automated setting, offering a proactive approach to address the issues advertisers commonly face. Moreover, certain customers may have zero conversions on most data points in their data, while others have minimal baseline activity with sporadic bursts of high conversions. We term these scenarios as a zero-inflated response and an over-dispersed response, respectively. Consider the presented causal graph. Even though it is a drastic simplification of the environment, we notice some critical assumptions. First and foremost, we assume that our expenditure on upper funnel activities has a lagging effect on search queries, web traffic, and sales. We also assume that the underlying demand can be decomposed into several components based on factors such as the day of the week, the day of the month, pay dates, etc. Furthermore, we assume that our spending on lower funnel activities is affected by this demand. And this demand also affects our outcomes, such as search traffic, web traffic, and sales. Thus, we have an open backdoor via demand. This means that in our historical data, we might see strong correlations between, for example, paid search spending and sales, even though it might be the case that paid search spending did not incrementally lift sales. This creates a contrasting objective for our allocator. Assuming that an increase in underlying demand positively impacts marketing efforts, we may want to utilize these spikes in demand, sometimes by increasing our budget, but we also want to disentangle the baseline sales. However, the opposite can also be postulated. During high demand, competitors will also advertise more, which will increase the marketing cost. Thus, decreasing the budget during high demand could also be beneficial depending on the sector. Now, we will address these concerns by explicitly controlling our inputs using techniques from dual control and experimental design to effectively navigate the exploration versus exploitation trade-off. Moreover, we also assume that our expenditure does not directly affect the underlying demand, which is a limitation in our setup. To address this adequately, one would need to resort to brand building schemes as the one depicted in the report by Peter Kane I previously mentioned. We also notice that the underlying demand affects all the endogenous variables, the endogenous variables to the system. Thus, if we set up a structural equation model or Bayesian network of this recursive structure, our estimate of, for example, web traffic on sales will be biased due to this unobserved co-founder demand. Due to the considerations outlined in the previous slide, we opt for a conventional model with some notable tweaks. We assume that the underlying demand can be decomposed into various factors such as the day of the week, the day of the month, pay dates, etc. We also assume that these factors impact marketing efficiency. Now, we refrain from modeling some effects with continuous properties and instead employ step functions. This choice is driven by the observation that certain events, like the days preceding and following the pay dates, exhibit abrupt changes in effects, better suited for a non-continuous scheme. Therefore, we choose to model day-of-the-month coefficients and special events, such as Black Friday, with step functions, while events that have a constant frequency and that does not exhibit such abrupt changes in effect, such as the day of the week, are modeled using Fourier terms, which seems to be the go-to method for capturing seasonality in our context. To capture stochastic time-varying effects, we adopt the weighting scheme proposed by NG and Wang in their report on the BTVC. Essentially, we place knots at different time steps and compute a weighted average for the time steps in between the knots using kernel functions. Now, we can combine the effects of the day of the week, the day of the month, and trends by weighting them with factors that sums to 1 if we want to force a coefficient to be supported solely on an interval, such as a saturation parameter, assuming then a power function. To be able to generalize the solution to a vast range of different clients operating in different sectors and countries, we deploy a model selection scheme. The model selector can opt for either a multiplicative model or an additive model, whereas in the latter case it can also include interactions. The model selector can choose to include different components and can also select different configurations for these components depending on the amount of historical data, the sector and the country. Now, to break down the various configurations and their parametrizations. The trend is modeled according to the weighting scheme proposed by NG and Wang in their report on the BTVC. The model selector is responsible for choosing the number of knots and determining their placement. Seasonality is modeled using Fourier terms, and the model selector has the flexibility to choose the degree. Cyclical effects or day-of-the-month effects are modeled with step functions. The model selector can choose between different intervals of days, such as inserting a dummy for the interval from the 25th to the 31st, or for example a set of intervals depicting each week of the month. Adjustments are made for shifts in pay dates. For instance, in Sweden, if the pay date is the 25th and falls on a weekend and our model included a bin having a lower bound at the 25th, that bin will be shifted to the weekday adjacent to the weekend of the 25th in that particular month. And finally, special events are modeled using dummy variables. As for the saturation component, it is modeled as a weighted sum of the different components. If the model selector chooses all components, we deploy a weighting scheme to assure that the saturation component lays in the interval from 0 to 1. Additionally, the model selector can choose to incorporate add stock as a weighted sum of previous expenditure or by injecting lagged previous expenditure linearly. By mapping up the different components onto the day of the week, day of the month, etc., we can easily forecast these effects over an horizon and therefore capitalize on differences in efficiency during a particular month. By combining this with a weighting scheme proposed by NG and Wang, we can allow the overall effect of these components to vary stochastically. The flexibility provided by the model selector allows for adapting the model to different scenarios and optimizing its configuration based on specific requirements and the client's historical data. Now, we chose to model this with Bayesian methods since we can acquire informative priors, which we will touch on later on. As for setting non-informative priors, we follow the insights derived from the Google report, Bayesian methods for media mix modeling with carryover and shape effects. Now, before discussing informative priors, we will briefly discuss the inference. So, we need a method to approximate our posteriors. And the two primary options are Markov chain Monte Carlo methods, or MCMC for short, which is a sampling-based approach, and the other one is variational inference, or VI for short, which is an optimization-based approach. Now, MCMC offers the advantage of asymptotically approximating the true posterior, while VI is generally faster. One might argue that since precision is crucial in our context, MCMC approaches should be favored. However, it is worth noting that early MCMC methods guarantees that we will be able to sample from the true posterior asymptotically, but they may not achieve this within a reasonable time frame. Nonetheless, a specific form of MCMC sampling called Hamiltonian Monte Carlo can achieve this more efficiently in many scenarios compared to the early approaches such as vanilla Metropolis Hastings and Gibbs sampling. HMC efficiently finds and stays within what is referred to as the typical set of posterior space. Now, an extension to vanilla HMC, called no U-turn sampling or NUTS for short, accomplishes this even more efficiently. Furthermore, NUTS is readily available in packages such as PyMC, Pyro, and Stan, which is another benefit. If you're not familiar with HMC, I strongly recommend studying this paper, A Conceptual Introduction to Hamiltonian Monte Carlo by Michael Bettencourt. MCMC sampling also provides a diverse set of diagnostics, crucial for stopping an automatic system in our context. In particular, we can send notices to developers in case of divergent chains or if metrics such as R-hats exceed a certain threshold. This ensures effective monitoring and intervention, which is crucial in our context. Now, the reason for adopting a Bayesian approach in our case is the ability to derive informative priors. With access to an extensive amount of customer data and the ability to actively experiment with different campaign expenditures, we can establish informative priors that significantly enhance budget allocation. Now, this is one of the main reasons why it's so valuable for a client to outsource their budget allocation to a vendor such as ourselves. Due to our sheer amount of data within different sectors and countries, we have access to far more information than the normal advertiser that's solely able to access its own historical data. Furthermore, this is especially valuable for clients with low expenditure variance, multicollinear spending, endogeneity issues in their data, and particularly for clients with no prior advertising history, as the priors we can construct can mitigate a lot of these issues. However, we're still facing the challenge of determining which data to use. Solely considering the sector can reveal important aspects such as potential reach. Similarly, considering the country allows us to capture the effect of specific events and holidays. However, either one in isolation is insufficient, as the reach in a sector can vary significantly between different countries. However, focusing only on the country might overlook crucial aspects like reach or saturation within a particular sector or customer segment. Consequently, we opt to construct priors based on insights obtained from analyzing experimental data from customers within the target sector and country. We follow the approach proposed in section 4 of the Google paper titled A Hierarchical Bayesian Approach to Improve Media Mix Models Using Category Data. Now, this approach enables us to maintain some sort of anonymity between customers in a specific sector and country. Essentially, the priors we establish for a specific client are extrapolated from insights derived from other customer data rather than being directly derived from the actual data itself. To be able to automate this system for a wide range of customers, we need a model selector. However, to construct an efficient one is a highly complex task given our context. Now, there's a definite value in being able to predict accurately, especially for our target return on ad spend customers, but also in analytics. Now, the main question we want to answer, however, is fundamentally different. It is a causal one. Namely, if I increase the budget with X amount, how will that affect sales? Now, the standard way of conducting model selection when being an analyst and not a decision maker is to construct a metric from which we compare and evaluate models. There's a wide range of metrics out there that encapsulate different performance factors. However, their focus is on predictive performance. Typical ones in the Bayesian realm are BIC and WAIC, both considering in-sample data, and they have this typical configuration of a goodness of fit term and a penalty term to combat overfitting. For out-of-sample metrics, one can deploy a loose CV approach, which in general is very time-consuming, but efficient implementations exist in the Bayesian realm, such as a SysLoo. Another way of conducting model selection is to actively decide on budget plans that aim to decipher which model is the most appropriate. A community aiming to address this challenge is the optimal experimental design community for model discrimination. Considering normally distributed observations, one of the metrics they use is the T criterion, which aims to find the decision/design that is the one that has an hypothesized outcome that the models disagrees the most about. When considering non-normal models, alternative utility functions that generalize to a much larger scope of models with different likelihoods and non-normally distributed errors, some other metrics have been proposed. An example of such a one is the one presented here, which maximizes the Kullback-Leibler divergence between hypothesized outcomes, given two different models and a set of priors that sums to one. Now, since model selection is the backbone of an automated product in this context, we cannot disclose our full model selection scheme due to company privacy agreements. Now, moving on to the actual decision making and our optimization scheme, I want to point out that many known issues in media mix modeling may be dealt with more effectively by explicitly addressing the exploration versus exploitation dilemma using techniques from the sequential decision optimization communities. Multicollinearity, low variance in expenditure, environmental changes, endogeneity, and the related issues can be addressed efficiently, maybe in certain cases, by explicitly controlling the environment by means of exploring, or in other words, probing the system for more information about our parameters, and exploitation, or in other words, use the information we have now as to just maximize sales. By passively learning, we may not be able to efficiently break the endogeneity into data. Thus, we may benefit from using probing actions perturbing the system for information, or in other words, exploration. The problem of trying to learn about the system while still trying to maximize sales given our context can be formulated as a sequential decision optimization problem under uncertainty. Now, in our approach, we deploy a so-called fixed horizon model predictive control scheme. We set the horizon to be until the end of the month. This allows us to effectively capitalize on the day of the week and day of the month and pay dates and special event effects. We consider a campaign-based segmentation and daily revisions of the budget plan as can be depicted in the algorithm. The system starts off by identifying the sector of the client, the targeting country, as well as retrieving historical data from the sector and the country, as well as from the client. The system then generates informative priors. If no sector and country data is available, the algorithm resorts to non-informative priors. It then proceeds to find an appropriate model and estimate this model with the aforementioned MCMC sampling. We then sample from the posterior, in some sort of way, more on this later on, and proceed to construct an optimization problem over the whole horizon. The system then solves this optimization problem subject to the budget constraint. Now, more on this later on as well. We also may have some other constraints like the customer imposed constraints and the day-to-day increase and decrease budgetary constraints to address the issue of Facebook resetting the learning phase. After that, we deploy the budgeting decision for the current time step. After midnight, we retrieve the response, thus sales, and then we iterate the procedure from the first bullet point. Notice how a decision made today also takes into account the future effects. This means that the model may find it beneficial to save in on spending today to spend it tomorrow, or vice versa. This scheme obviously addresses those concerns. Also notice that every day we retrieve data and revise our budget plan accordingly. Thus the system will adapt to the most recent information available. The question, however, is how we should perform steps 4, 5 and 6. This is what we will discuss now. The canonical approach is the one typically presented in the media mix literature. It does not explicitly explore the environment, but instead aims to take the most exploitative action every time step. Furthermore, the literature in general does not consider the internal dynamics of the marketing platforms, such as Facebook resetting its learning stage if we increase or decrease the budget by too much. Moreover, the literature in general does not consider setting a factor dictating how much we can spend outside of previous expenditure, thus how much we allow our decisions to extrapolate beyond previous spend. If we take these factors into account, we have the optimization problem depicted above. Let y hat denote one of our media mix models, let m denote one sample, and capital M denote the total number of samples. In general, capital M is set to something quite large, like 2000, meaning that we sample 2000 samples from our posterior. Furthermore, let capital N denote the horizon and T the current time step. Let capital X subscript KT denote the spend for campaign K at time step T. We can then formulate this optimization problem as presented above. Now, this is a nonlinear but convex optimization problem, which can be solved by solvers such as sequential least squares quadratic programming methods, which are readily available in packages such as SciPy. I want to point out some important considerations. Notice that given our fixed horizon MPC approach presented in the previous slide, where we find the solution to this optimization problem above each day, deploy the decision for the current time step, retrieve the sales it generated, and then revise the budget plan for the next day, we are passively learning. This is very important to grasp. Just because we chose this exploitative approach, it does not mean that we're not learning. We're still learning, but it's passive. We're not actively trying to probe the system for more information. It may be that this approach is sufficient. It may be that it would be better to explicitly probe the system for more information. It all depends on the historical data, the sector in which the clients operate, etc. I also want to point out that using map estimates may not be the best approach. Although using map estimates would drastically reduce the computational burden of the approach depicted above, map estimates can be highly problematic in high dimensions. They do not depict a typical set of posterior space well and can find themselves even outside the typical set in spikes of high density. Furthermore, I also seen developers using guardrails after sampling from these posteriors. They typically set a threshold like a quantile for how extreme values the samples can take on, and this is usually done independently for each variable. Now, this approach is dangerous, since the variables tend to exhibit strong correlations. Therefore, it is advisable to assess samples as a whole and refrain from treating each variable within a sample independently and cutting them off based on thresholds. An approach similar to this one, but that explores more, is what we will discuss next. Thompson sampling is a widely employed technique in the bandit and reinforcement learning literature. In this approach, a single sample is drawn from the posterior. And this sample is utilized as the ground truth in the optimization problem. This method may offer some advantages, including enhanced exploration, at least compared to the exploitative approach discussed earlier. Notably, this simplifies the objective function. Since we're solely sampling a single set of parameters from our posterior, it leads to a reduction in computational burden. However, there are drawbacks to this approach. In the bandit literature, the emphasis often lies on infinite horizons, whereas Thompson sampling offers some great regret guarantees. However, in our case, with a finite horizon, this may not be optimal. To illustrate this claim, consider the extreme scenario where we find ourselves at the last time step of the current month. In that case, it is vital to utilize all available information and take the most exploitative action. But Thompson sampling would instead choose a random sample from the posterior, potentially deviating from the optimal exploitative strategy. Furthermore, we're not quantifying the information we gain by using Thompson sampling. We would like to quantify the information we gain, as this could lead to more efficient exploration, and preferably, we would like to quantify the information we gain in the same scale as our potential future outcomes. This is what we'll attempt to do in the following slides. Now, to quantify the information we gain and decide on actions that brings us the most information possible, we can deploy techniques from the optimal experimental design community. Namely, we try to find the decision/design that maximizes the expected information gain. Additionally, in order to strike a balance between exploration and exploitation, we implement an epsilon greedy approach. At each time step, we draw a sample from a Bernoulli distribution with p set to epsilon. If this sampled outcome is equal to 1, we opt for the exploitative action. Optimizing the problem then, well, in the canonical approach we discussed earlier. Conversely, if it is 0, we instead maximize the expected information gain for the current time step. However, finding the decision that maximizes expected information gain is difficult. First of all, solely evaluating the expected information gain, analytically at least, given a design xi, is intractable. And secondly, we're dealing with a continuous space of designs. Notice that the expressions p of theta given y and xi, as well as p of y given xi, are both intractable, and that the latter expression is nested inside the expectation. Now, we deal with this by using nested Monte Carlo sampling. Implementations of this technique are readily available in packages such as Pyro. Secondly, to actually find the design that maximizes this expression, we rely on Bayesian optimization. Now, this approach has its benefits. For example, it might be easier to explain to clients that we're sometimes maximizing information gain as a way of exploring than to explain that Thompson sampling is our way of dealing with the exploration versus exploitation trade-off. Furthermore, if the client wants to just explore the environment for a certain period of time, this approach has its obvious benefits in comparison to the Thompson sampling approach. However, we can see some cons as well. First off, epsilon is a tunable parameter, deciding how much we should explore. And in our environment, which is non-stationary, we may not be able to rely on the typical approach to reach convergence in RL, where we let epsilon tend to 0 as time tends to infinity. Thus, we need to tune this parameter carefully, which can pose a challenging problem. Secondly, the information gain is not measured in the same scale as our expected future outcomes. Preferably, we would like to quantify the information we gain in the same scale as our predicted sales will be in the future. This would allow us to understand how we can strike a perfect balance between exploration and exploitation. Now, there are several approaches to doing this, and two of the main ones being Bayesian reinforcement learning and dual control, which we will discuss in the following slides. To quantify the information we gain in the same scale as our future outcomes, we can resort to Bayesian reinforcement learning. While it can be hard to incorporate prior uncertainties into our formulation of the typical reinforcement learning formulation of the MDP, Bayesian RL allows for this. In particular, by formulating a base adaptive Markov decision process, we can incorporate uncertainties over transition and reward functions, which aligns with our context. Now, a base adaptive Markov decision process is formulated by the tuple capital P superscript plus, capital A, capital S superscript plus, and the R superscript plus. where capital P superscript plus, capital S superscript plus, and capital R superscript plus denotes the augmented transition function, state space, and reward function respectively. Let H superscript T denote the historical data up until time step T, and let capital H denote the set of all such possible histories. We can then define the augmented state space capital S superscript plus as S times H, where capital S denotes the original state space and capital H the set of all possible histories, as previously mentioned. Now, let P of capital P denote the prior over transition models. We can then update capital P as depicted above, where tau denotes normalization constant. We can define the transition function as this, and given a prior over reward function P of capital R, we can define the reward function as this. To align this formulation with our context, we draw insights from a report from the Sequential Optimal Experimental Design community, namely a PhD thesis made by Adam Foster called Variational, Monte Carlo, and Policy-Based Approaches to Bayesian Experimental Design, in which he formulated the SOED problem as a base adaptive Markov decision process. We define our problem as the following, where theta denotes our current posteriors over parameters, and x subscript kt denotes the spend for marketing campaign k at time step t. Notice that this formulation aligns with the original formulation. Now, an important thing to note is that if we could solve this, we would have found a policy which will behave optimally with regards to the exploration versus exploitation trade-off given our prior. We have, in other words, perfectly quantified the information we gain in the same scale as our outcomes, which is precisely what we wanted. However, we have a continuous action space, continuous state space, and we need to rely on sampling to approximate the integrals and posteriors. Furthermore, we have a set of hard constraints we need to adhere to. Also notice that it's not really necessary to compute policies in our case. The only decision that really matters is the one of today. Now, instead of using techniques typically employed in Bayesian reinforcement learning, we will turn to dual control. The dual control community typically consider hard constraints on inputs and how the system evolves, something that aligns with our context. Furthermore, they tend to consider MPC formulations, which also aligns with our context. Dual control can be divided into explicit dual control and implicit dual control. The former typically adds a benefit for exploration in the objective function, while the latter aim to solve the Bellman equations approximately. We opt for the latter one. In particular, we draw inspiration from two reports in this community. One made by Alena Arcari, Lucas Heving, and Melanie N. Seilinger, and another one made by David S. Bayard and Mansour Eslami. I'm very sorry if I pronounced your names wrong. What sets our approach apart is the need to adhere to computations involving non-conjugate priors and non-Gaussian likelihoods. Contrast, Arcari, Heving, and Seilinger were able to propagate the posterior over the horizon efficiently given the assumption of normally distributed parameters. The critical difference in our case lies in dealing with non-conjugate priors and the potential absence of Gaussian likelihoods. We propose a somewhat rudimentary method to address this, which is feasible within our setting. Another difference is the reward function. In the control literature, the focus tends to be on minimizing costs, where the cost is dependent on the physical state of, for example, a drone tracking an airplane. In our case, we have parameterized the reward function with media mix models, and we seek to maximize rewards. In particular, consider the formulation above. Let I subscript k denote the information vector at time step k. It consists of data on previous expenditure and sales. Let theta denote our set of parameters. Let x subscript nk denote the spend on marketing channel n at time step k. We can then proceed to define the Bellman equations and the optimal policy by J superscript star, which is the one satisfying the Bellman equation. Theta, thus our posteriors, can be updated recursively according to equation 2, the update equation. To solve the Bellman equations would mean that we have computed a policy that will behave optimally with respect to the prior p of theta. However, the same challenges discussed in the base adaptive Markov decision process formulation in the previous slide remains. Due to the exploding dimensionality, we need a way of simplifying this expression. Two ways of doing that are by first approximating the expectation with sampling. Secondly, we can approximate the cost to go / reward to go function J subscript k plus 1 of I subscript k plus 1. We do this by decomposing the horizon into explorative and exploitative parts. Let j hat of I subscript L, capital L, denote the terminal reward at time step capital L, given a suboptimal base policy. In our case, we define the base policy as the canonical optimizer presented in the previous slides, given information vector I capital L. We can then define the stochastic dynamic programming recursion as this, for k equal to 1 up to capital L. Now, this means we have created a capital L step look-ahead problem, where capital L is a tunable parameter. To deal with the expectation in this equation, we sample parameters from our posterior theta and disturbance terms w subscript k and average over the samples. Now, since we're dealing with a non-linear reward function, non-conjugate priors, and arbitrary likelihoods, we need a way of proposing new actions. To address this problem, we treat the optimization problem as a black box and use Bayesian optimization to propose inputs. Furthermore, instead of recursively updating our posterior according to the update equation presented here, we perform a full update based on all the data in I subscript k. More formally, we can formulate the optimization problem and visualize it as following. Now, let h denote the number of proposals and x subscript tm denote the input vector with dimension 1 times capital K at time step t given sample m. Set capital L to be equal to 1, thus we consider just a one-step look ahead in the dual part, and denote a sampled scenario from the first stage as m. Let j denote one sampled scenario from the second stage j. Furthermore, let I subscript k superscript m denote the information vector at time step k given sample m. Let r subscript m denote the first stage predicted reward given sample m. Let x subscript kt denote the input for channel k at time step t. Furthermore, set the horizon to capital N and let capital H denote the horizon in time steps. The proposed scheme can then be viewed as a scenario tree depicted to the right, where each scenario depends on samples of theta subscript m and w subscript m. More precisely, at every stage, we sample a set of scenarios theta subscript m from our posterior given the information vector I subscript k, and epsilon is sampled from either a normal distribution, negative binomial distribution, or a standard t distribution, depending on the likelihood function given the information vector. We propose an action with Bayesian optimization, observe a hypothesized reward R subscript m, compute the posterior, update the deterministic physical constraints, and feed the information vector and the constraints to the base policy, thus the canonical optimizer, which results in a total reward for that scenario in action. By averaging over scenarios per action, we obtain an estimate of the expected return of that action. More formally, given a maximized ROAS objective, the aim is to solve the optimization problem to the left. Notice that given the problem context, this is the only problem we need to solve. Since we will take actions today given the information state today and then repeat this process every day, we do not need to compute a policy for any possible information state. Notice that the formulation allows for parallelization, reducing the computational time. In particular, one could distribute each scenario on a separate computer. Now, the proposed technique can also be extended to account for structural model uncertainty, essentially incorporating a model selection approach into the dual aspect of the problem. Now, this approach can be depicted in another report made by Lena Arkari, Lukas Heving, Max Schlichting, and Melanie Seilinger. Once again, sorry if I pronounced your name wrong. And the report is called Dual Stochastic MPC for Systems with Parametric and Structural Uncertainty. This is a very interesting avenue to explore, however, we devote this to future work. Now, I must say that we recognize that our approach is not scalable and is computationally inefficient. There are better ways to achieve this. First, one could utilize particle filters or sequential Monte Carlo methods to propagate the posteriors over the horizon with potential non-conjugate priors, nonlinear dynamics, and non-Gaussian likelihoods. Additionally, instead of proposing new values with Bayesian optimization, one could attempt to unnest the minimizations in the optimization problem as suggested by Arkari and her colleagues. However, in our specific context, the approaches to dealing with the exploration versus exploitation dilemma in the previous slides and in this slide may have some issues. This is what we will discuss now. Now, a danger with the sampling-based approaches is that we might sample from a posterior affected by endogeneity issues. It might point in a direction that is not true to the underlying parameter. This could happen when the previous controller had a false reward function and allocated based on demand without considering the baseline. A phenomenon that has been discussed under the terms self-fulfilling bias and reinforcement bias and addressed in the causal reinforcement learning literature, such as in the reports listed here. The issue then is that even though we have solved the exploration versus exploitation problem with, for example, dual control or Bayesian reinforcement learning methods, we have solved it with respect to our prior, which inherently points in the wrong direction. The idea really is to intervene on our expenditure variables that are affected by demand, irrespective of demand. Notice that we're not doing this by sampling from a posterior conditional on data with endogeneity issues. Now, one idea is to utilize data that we're confident does not have these endogeneity issues and disregard the rest. That is obviously a quite crude way of circumventing this issue, and we're losing a lot of potentially precious information. However, by doing this, we can assure ourselves that we're less affected by the endogeneity issues due to demand. Now, to make use of the prior data we have, one can come up with another scheme that involves experimental design. Namely, with some random factor epsilon, use techniques from experimental design that do not consider sampling from the posterior. Doing this alongside constructing informative priors solely based on data from the explorative/experimental actions, solely using experimental data from the sector and country, that could be a very sound and scalable solution for effective causal inference and subsequently budget optimization. This is the approach we aim to deploy in the future. Notice how we will circumvent the issue of doing experiments during short periods of time by doing this. Since we're controlling the budgets for many clients within a given sector and country, we can spread out the experimentation and periods during which it takes place, effectively constructing an ongoing experimentation phase which all customers benefit from without them having to do the experimentation themselves, thus reducing the costs associated with experimentation for the specific client. In the single client case, one can come up with some heuristics. For example, during dates, day of the week, day of the month, etc., with high expenditure, one can inject probing actions from experimental design, possibly with a control treatment group split to assure internal validity. Caution though, to draw justified conclusions from such an experiment, one has to assume certain background conditions, such as common trends for both groups, since we cannot control for all background factors in the environment. Now, having discussed different approaches of dealing with the exploration versus exploitation dilemma, let us consider our simulations. We conducted a simulation study to explore how different algorithms behave in diverse scenarios. These scenarios include factors such as multicollinear previous spending, endogeneity issues, and various time-varying components. In a simulation study, we work with a known model aiming to mirror the target. In other words, the actual model governing the data generation process in the real environment. We can assess different models based on their alignment, be it positive, neutral, or negative, with a target. For an in-depth discussion on crafting effective simulations in digital marketing, please refer to the report Introduction to the Aggregate Marketing System Simulator by Vavier and Chang. Once again, sorry if I pronounced your names wrong. We set up two different noise types that are intended to capture two different disturbances typically observed when working with our client data. One noise type encompasses clients with sporadic bursts of conversions, which is typical for clients selling expensive goods and clients that receive bulk orders sporadically. The other noise type encompasses the clients that have a steady yet strong degree of disturbances in conversions without too many outliers. A scenario typical for clients selling lower priced products B2C. Furthermore, we assumed a local linear trend, weekday seasonalities, and day-of-month effects as the baseline, and we assumed that the marketing efficiency was based on the day of the week and day of the month. We assumed higher baseline sales as well as marketing efficiency during the days after the paydates and during weekends, which is typical for our e-commerce clients. We compared the canonical approach, Thomson sampling, epsilon greedy with expected information gain, the implicit dual control method, and also made some heuristics, such as implicit dual control with E greedy, where the explorative action was based on traditional experimental design. We also set up baselines, such as a canonical weekly and a canonical monthly, which refer to the typical case where advertisers set a constant spend with weekly revisions or monthly revisions respectively. In our simulations, we assume a known model structure, reserving future work to study cases involving an unknown model. We conducted simulations on both cold starts and access to historical data, where we set the previous data to be generated according to different scenarios, encompassing multilinearity, endogeneity, low variance and expenditure. We also established an optimal controller by basing it on a model with known parameter values and optimizing greedily in relation to it. The simulation spanned from January 1st, 2023 to January 1st, 2024, with 5 Monte Carlo samples ran for each algorithm. I want to highlight that this may not be the best way to run a comparative study of this sort. And we obviously cannot draw any wide conclusions about which algorithm functions the best given this simple setup. I want to point out that these simulations and the corresponding results are not the primary result of this study. Instead, we're currently engaging in case studies where we deploy some of these algorithms on real-world clients. However, to get a hint of how these different algorithms behave given this very specific scenario, we can consider results on the following slide. The results indicate that the canonical or greedy approach is the most effective strategy overall. It is worth noting that this approach also performed well in cold start scenarios. Despite expectations that an algorithm emphasizing exploration would be more successful over 3 and 6 month periods. The implicit dual control method and epsilon greedy with expected information gain emerged as the second best approaches. Surprisingly, the canonical weekly and monthly approaches were not as bad as one might believe, at times even outperforming other algorithms. This could be due to the challenge of tracking a dynamic target while updating the model at each time step, causing significant input fluctuations driven by minimal noise. But it could also be due to the actual setup, where the seasonal effects were not as strong as one might expect when working with real-life data. But it could also be due to solely running 5 Monte Carlo simulations. However, the results indicates that in general, it is strongly advisable to run revisions every day. Nonetheless, as I just mentioned, it is essential to acknowledge potential criticism of the simulation setup. For instance, relying on only 5 Monte Carlo simulations may lead to non-generalizable results, as this quantity might not sufficiently filter out the randomness of sampling. Additionally, the underlying model may face scrutiny, for instance in its correlation between marketing entities' effectiveness and underlying demand. For example, including a scenario where competitor activities enhance marketing efficiency during low demand could yield a more nuanced perspective. Furthermore, the model itself may be critiqued for its absence of stochastically time-varying marketing efficiency. Future work should also record variances and ultimate parameter estimations, as they can provide an estimate of the future effectiveness beyond the current timeframe. Moreover, in future research, it is advisable to dismiss the assumption of a known model structure, as doing so would better depict real-life scenarios. However, it is vital to note that the primary focus of this report was not to derive conclusive findings regarding the effectiveness of various algorithms in our context. Instead, the report aimed to theoretically describe different algorithms that can be used when automating a budget allocation system. To derive justifiable conclusions, it is necessary to conduct extensive simulations across diverse scenarios and case studies, something we're currently engaged with. For a full breakdown of the results and the simulation setup, please refer to the report. Several improvements can be made to the proposed setup in mainly 3 areas. Constructing better models based on knowledge of the cause and effect relationships, constructing better optimization schemes given the model. Finally, maybe the most important avenue to exploring future work are the simulations. The simulations presented in this study may lack divergent validity and could be subject to various criticisms as previously discussed. One avenue for future work is to incorporate metrics other than the ones we have used here. A particularly interesting one could be to see how expenditure on upper funnel activities can generate audience lists in Google, which are subsequently targeted in Google. To quantify this impact would be an interesting avenue to explore in future work. The approach proposed to deal with endogeneity issues in the data is based on experimental design and is not explicitly incorporated into the modeling scheme. Future work could investigate if one could automate a causal inference scheme given the problem setting, possibly with fixed effects estimation or construct instrumental variables potentially latent. Future studies can also study how to optimally trade off actions that aim at reducing the spurious correlations between expenditures and sales associated with unobserved co-founders and the natural exploration versus exploitation trade-off with respect to parameter uncertainty. The proposed model can be improved using Bayesian multivariate adaptive regression splines to reduce the number of change points and placements in a fully Bayesian setting. One could also try to decompose the time-varying components with Gaussian processes. potentially deploying a link function with support on Solus 0 to 1 to deal with saturation parameters. The proposed base adaptive Markov decision process formulation opens the door to incorporate techniques from reinforcement learning. Monte Carlo tree search could be one of them. Furthermore, the formulation facilitates the incorporation of stochastic costs, which would be a very interesting avenue to explore in future works. Now, that was everything I had for you guys today, and if you found this interesting, I strongly recommend studying the paper, which you can find in the link below. Thank you.